Good evening and a warm welcome to our panelists and to our YouTube viewers. On today's panel, we will be discussing the impacts of COVID-19 on the mental health of individuals and communities in North London and the UK more broadly, and how this has highlighted and exacerbated pre-existing and emerging inequalities. The pandemic has induced a considerable degree of fear, worry, and concern across the population at large, and among certain groups in particular, such as the youth, the elderly, key workers, and people with underlying health conditions. The British Medical Journal reported that increased psychological morbidity was evident in the UK and found to be more common in young people, women, and individuals who had been identified as part of the COVID-19 risk groups. Feelings of hopelessness and loneliness had been especially high among young people who have also experienced higher levels of stress and anxiety due to pressures of online school and concern for the future. A survey conducted by Young Minds at the beginning of last year found that 75% of participants found the last lockdown more difficult to cope with, and 67% believe that the pandemic will have a long-term impact on their mental health. Local councils and mental health charities have worked hard to tackle the increased demand for their services, and more 24-hour helplines were set up and e-consultations were made available. As we are emerging from the brunt of the pandemic, it's important that we assess its long-term impact on people's mental health and discuss measures to support those in need of assistance. And so in this forward-thinking panel, I'll be joined by Martine Drake, who is the Wellbeing, Learning and Activities Manager at Mind in Enfield and Barnet. And she will be speaking from the perspective of mental health charities who work to serve communities during the course of the pandemic. We'll also be joined by Dr. Celestin Okoroji, a postdoctoral fellow at the London School of Economics and research lead at Black Thrive Global CIC, who will speak on how media narratives and the mental health evidence landscape has had an impact on social and racial inequalities regarding mental health research, discourse, and access. We also have Kerim Balci, Chief Advisor at Human Rights Solidarity and founder of OnlineHizmet, who will be providing the perspective of faith and mental health in the refugee community, particularly in North London. My name is Cheriesse Bema-Kwakye. I am a research fellow and project coordinator at the Dialogue Society, and I'll be chairing this discussion. Thank you again to our audience for joining us, and we look forward to hearing your questions and contributions. Please do get these ready and share it with us over the course of this session in the chat function on YouTube. I will now hand over to Martine Drake.
Thank you, Cheriesse, and it's great to be part of the panel. I'm speaking, as you said, from the perspective of someone working in a mental health charity that's based in North East London. And I wanted to say something as a kind of a general background to what we mean by mental health problems, and things like that. So you sometimes hear people say that they don't have mental health. And what they really mean is that they don't have a mental health problem, because everybody has a dimension which is a mental health dimension. As much as we have a physical body, we have a mental body, which is to do with our thoughts and our feelings. So when we're talking about having a mental health problem, it's that our thoughts and our feelings are stopping us from doing everyday things. We don't get up, we can't socialize, we can't look after ourselves. And if that goes on for an extended period of time, because that can happen on and off, but if it goes on for a long time, that's when we actually need support and we need help. And unfortunately, sometimes people don't realize that, and equally, sometimes they do, but they're not quite sure where to get the help. So if we think about the reasons why somebody might have a mental health problem, we actually find it's to do with the wider issues in life. So the socio-economics that people find themselves in, physical issues can impact upon people. They can be victims of crime. And we do find that mental health issues do follow in families, but that doesn't mean to say that there's a genetic basis. It's not inevitable that somebody would have a mental health problem, even if there's a lot of mental health problems in the family. So as far as the statistics go, according to National Mind, in any 1 year, you would expect there to be 1 in 4 people with a mental health problem. And if we're talking about common mental health issues, which are things like depression, obsessive compulsive disorders, depression, that kind of thing, it's 1 in 6 in a week. Now, when I was first aware of mental health issues in the community, so about 20 years ago, that was 1 in 8 in a lifetime would have a mental health problem. So clearly, just in those 20 years, there's been an increase in mental health issues in the community. I don't actually know of any statistics that are able to say what the impacts of the pandemic have been, and perhaps other panelists do know about that. So as a mental health charity, what we have done in the past and continued to do through the pandemic was provide 3 main services. So the first is therapy, which is generally counselling, one-to-one, and the next service is advice and advocacy. So if people are not able to access services or find it difficult to speak for themselves, that's advocacy, and they can get advice about various issues. So these socioeconomic issues that are impacting on people's mental health can be supported in that way. And then the section that I work for, the Wellbeing section, is there to try and support people to make social connections, to develop other interests, to hopefully improve their sense that they're not alone and actually make positive connections with others in society. And we do that mainly through courses and activities. There's a lot of emphasis on creativity as well as personal development and sort of therapeutic options like mindfulness training, anger management, that kind of thing. Now, the basis of the response that we have is around the idea that it is possible to recover, but also that it's good to do things on a regular basis that support well-being generally. So there's an idea called the 5 ways to well-being, which are connect, observe, learn, get physical, and give. So the idea is that if you can do some of all of that anyway, the chances of having a mental health issue is reduced. And if you do have a mental health issues, these things will help in your recovery. So that's the approach that we're coming from. In terms of the impact of the pandemic on us, it was that we had to stop providing face-to-face support for our clients. And within 3 or 4 weeks, we managed to start our services online. But immediately we're aware that that was not going to be suitable for everybody. So about 80% of the people that approached us for counselling, because people were still calling us and making contact, they were happy to have counselling through Zoom or on the phone, something like that. But we were also aware that there were people that couldn't access us in that way. And that wasn't something that we could particularly resolve, and that we've not really been able to resolve even now. So, for example, in our Enfield building, we still don't have a building that's suitable for safe working. We're looking for that to start next month. We then will be able to do face-to-face work, at least one-to-one. We cannot go back to doing group work yet because we are tending to work with people who are vulnerable, we have to still think about safe distancing and that kind of thing. So the pandemic would definitely have had an impact on people that would have struggled to access the technology to work with us. And there wasn't really a local response to that. There were lots of local responses to the need for food, making sure that people were looked after through safeguarding and that kind of thing. But as far as our service was concerned, we couldn't do very much at all. From a personal point of view, I kind of reflect on different societies that I'm aware of. And I've come to know the society in Morocco quite well over an extended period of time. I've been backwards and forwards until recently, over the last 8 years. And what I'm conscious of is that the 5 ways to well-being still seem to apply in that society, but because of the nature of the society, there are different ways in which people connect. It does seem in that society that people quite readily connect in quite large groups. Families are still very much connected and not kind of dissipated. Certainly people are very, very observant. I would say to a greater degree than they are in this society. Certainly people are learning there in many different ways. And it's a very physical society. A lot of life is spent outdoors, and for many people that is on the land. And also as a society, it strikes me that there is an ethos of giving. I think in the West, there's a sense of giving at particular times for particular purposes, and we make a great show of spending money. Whereas I have become aware that it can be a very strong part of the way that people live on a daily basis. And the last thing I want to say is that there's also, I think, a sense in that community that you're connecting to something greater, and you're connecting to the natural world and also to something very spiritual. And again, that isn't necessarily a strong part of people's lives in this society. So I think there are different things that we can learn across societies that would have benefit for everybody's mental health. Thank you.
Thank you, Martine, for giving us a very insightful contribution and for giving us just sort of an account of how Mind as an organization has had to deal with the pandemic, the technical difficulties and the ways that they had to adapt, and also in terms of physical space to provide the same quality services during the pandemic as well. And I also found it very interesting how you drew to the Moroccan culture and how the five ways of well-being can be adapted in different societies, and drawing the links and the similarities in different societies, and how the approaches can be tailored. So thank you very much for contributing, and I'll now pass on to Dr. Celestin to talk to us. Thank you.
Hello. Right, let's try and share this screen again. I hope you can see that. Yes, Cheriesse, okay, I'm seeing you nodding, so that's good. Okay, yeah, thanks for inviting me along. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. And it's especially interesting for me to be in this space and to listen to all of you, because I'm a Tottenham boy myself, and North London and its various communities are very dear to me. With that said, Cheriesse gave me a good introduction, and even though I hadn't told her beforehand what I was going to say, she's kind of hit the nail on the head. So I want to approach my time on this virtual stage to walk very briefly through a kind of history of the pandemic through the lens of the Black community, and I focus here particularly on the Black community, partly because, you know, thinking in terms of concepts like BME and BAME mask kind of particular experiences for different groups, and also because there's a kind of special relationship between the Black community and unethical medical experimentation, which forms a sort of backdrop to what I want to say. I won't have time to say a huge amount about that, but I'm sure, you know, friends and colleagues here can offer resources to those who are interested in learning more about that. Okay, so with that said, I wonder if anyone who's watching online or anyone on the panel remembers these two men. All the way back in March 2020, so this is like pre-first lockdown, these two French scientists argued on national television that it was silly to test the vaccines in Europe because of the widespread use of masks. Instead, they argued that it would be better to test the vaccine on Africans. And there was a huge uproar about this, particularly obviously in Black communities. And in particular, there were a range of discourses centering around Black people being used as lab rats. And this is what kind of began to circulate around that time. And given the context of historical and contemporary medical mistreatment, this is obviously quite logical. Okay, so these two guys go on TV and they say, we should test this vaccine, which has not yet been approved, on African populations in Africa. So of course, there's kind of like an uproar around this. Okay, and then what happened next was, you know, the vaccines were about to be approved, and here's Matt Hancock. Do you remember Matt Hancock? This guy was a famous figure at one time, you know, on the news every day. And he announced that certain vulnerable groups would be given priority access when a vaccine was approved. And given the context I've just described, you can see how, despite potentially best intentions, this approach would kind of serve to further marginalize already skeptical populations. And the narrative that developed around this time in Black communities, again, used language like targeting, trialing, i.e. Black communities were being targeted for a vaccine which was still, at the time, unapproved for use. But, you know, officials largely ignored these concerns, as far as I can tell, but maybe other people have a different view. And there was not really any local or national messaging which would serve to allay these concerns. So more importantly, though, at the time, policy and public health professionals had not really understood the power of the messenger, okay? So that is to say that it matters both what the message is and whether or not the person delivering the message is credible to the audience that is intended to receive this message. So this is where we were at a time in relation to the pandemic and vaccines and so on. But the narrative does move on, and it moves on in a way which I think was problematic and is problematic. So what transpired instead was a kind of narrative about vaccine hesitancy, which almost by definition suggests a certain irrationality. Okay, so like, why would you be hesitant about these vaccines? And in this article in The Guardian, which is about a year ago, they declare that 72% of Black people are vaccine hesitant. Okay, unfortunately, they, and presumably many others, failed to look at the underlying numbers which support this claim. Okay, actually, the total Black population in this survey is 190. 190 Black people were used as a proxy for the views of the entire Black population in the UK, right? UK survey revealed. So we're assuming this is national. Okay, so I have to say, I'm not hugely popular or a celebrity, but there are more than 190 Black people in my phone book. Okay, so I don't see how this could be used as a kind of like, here's what all of Black people think, right? I think instead of being a kind of piece of robust science around the views of Black people, this is a kind of palatable version of events for a society that has failed to engage with Black communities and to consider their perspectives, and importantly, to consider that their perspectives are valid. Okay, given what I've already said to you, why shouldn't people be hesitant of the vaccine? Okay, so there's also another, this is my final piece on this sort of narrative here. So let me give one final example. Okay, so like in the late pandemic, this is after all the vaccines are out now, lots of people are being vaccinated, we're on second jabs, potentially third jabs, and the vaccines are widely available. There was talk in many quarters about boosting immunity. Okay, so like public health professionals will know, like there's absolutely no such thing as boosting your immunity. Fine, okay, but a lot of this was tied up with what we might call like conspiratorial beliefs and so on. And there was an urge to kind of like destroy this knowledge, okay? Nevertheless, there was a particular angle on this in the Black community, which basically focused on eating fresh fruit and vegetables. Okay, this was boosting the immunity, was eating fresh fruit, vegetables. And I would argue that at any other time, if large sections of a community were having conversations about eating more healthily and getting more exercise, this would have been a massive win for public health. Okay, what is wrong with this is not really clear if we stand back a little bit. You know, after all, they've been trying to get us to eat, you know, 5 a day for years and years and years. Okay, so like here are people saying that they're going to eat more healthily in order to like stave off coronavirus. Why isn't this a good thing? Okay, and it seems as though, it seems to me, you know, rather than building on these assets in the community and potentially finding ways to make vaccination compatible with existing community generated knowledge, instead, I think what we've seen is an ambition to essentially annihilate the knowledge of other groups. And to a large extent, I think this still reflects a kind of colonial relationship between the British state and its Black and brown citizens. What we know and what we do is something to be extinguished in favor of, you know, the enlightened knowledge of the state. Okay, so this is like a whole backdrop now, and you'll notice that I haven't said anything about mental health, but I think Martine touched on what I do want to say about it, which is that, you know, my kind of philosophy is that poor mental health arises from context of social exclusion, okay? And everything that I've discussed today amounts to problems of social exclusion. It's the sense that, you know, Black people are being targeted, excluded, and have some kind of inherent deficits. And these, for me, explain some proportion of the disproportionate mental health outcomes that we see for Black people. So it's not just in this like pandemic context that we see this, right? We see this in almost every context where the ways of being, the ways of thinking, the culture, the kind of norms, values of Black people are kind of seen as like abhorrent in some way, backward, or just wrong in some sense. And, you know, if we want to do something about that, we need to know more. But as I've briefly shown today, most of the things that policymakers think they know about Black communities is based on shoddy evidence or no evidence at all, just kind of guesswork. So, you know, maybe, you know, people who are watching this have been going around in their day job saying, you know, Black people are vaccine hesitant. How do you know? How many Black people did you ask before you came to this conclusion? So I think we need not just more Black people as like research participants, but Black people as researchers themselves, right? Lived experience is important. The question that a Black person may ask will be different from the questions asked by people who have not lived under the effects of white supremacy in the same way as Black people have. And this, I think, is like really important and is, as I say, what is missing. Not just Black participants, you definitely need some of those. 190 Black people is not enough to make a conclusion about the whole population of Black people in the country, but you also need more Black researchers. And finally, I think I'm just on time. In the context of this talk with the Dialogue Society of all organizations, I think you will agree that other people's knowledge is valuable and important. And the role of public authorities is not to attempt to destroy other people's knowledges and ways of being. Rather, it's to look for the value in their cultures and link that to our collective problems. Yes, there is a problem of coronavirus. Yes, vaccines will help, but it's not vaccine only. It's vaccine and a healthy diet and all of these other things. So yeah, that's kind of what I want to say. And I think I'll stop there because I think that's my time. So thank you. How do I stop sharing now? There we go.
Thank you very much, Celestin. That was a very useful timeline of the sort of media narratives which highlight the failure to engage with Black people in research with coronavirus so far, and also how the colonial relationship between the British state and Black British people in the UK has manifested itself in the different stages and the different discursive arenas throughout the pandemic. So thank you very much for your contribution. I will now be handing over to Kerim Balci, who will speak on his experience engaging with the Muslim community and also the refugee population in North London.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this valuable event. I will be speaking about Hizmet Online, which was a community support project we have been running since the earliest days of the pandemic. In fact, the idea had already come to fruition by the end of 2019 when we realized that the pandemic was ticking in. I will be speaking about a particular segment of the Muslim community of not only of North London, but largely of North London, but also distributed all around the United Kingdom. In fact, distributed only very recently. I'm speaking about the Hizmet community of Great Britain. Hizmet community is largely Turkey-based community, which had to move out of the country because of grand-scale persecution of the community on political grounds that has been taking place in the last 6 to 7 years. The community has been receiving newcomers, in the last 7 years, firstly in the form of a particular agreement between United Kingdom and Turkey that actually provided a channel to become naturalized in this country, the Ankara Agreement, by way of building small businesses in this country, and later on by asylum seeking processes. In the last several years, the United Kingdom Home Office started to distribute newcomers, the asylum seekers, to all around the United Kingdom, particularly the north, and also to cities like Cardiff and Swansea, and suddenly new Hizmet communities of only a few people, like 10 families, 15 families started to pop up in those locations also. But traditionally, North London is the home of the Turkish-speaking community of United Kingdom, which can reach to some 300,000 people, according to how you count Turkish-speaking people. And anyhow, Hizmet community is only a minute detail of this population, but it's a very highly educated, influential population, which has impact on the overall Turkish-speaking community and also the Muslim community of United Kingdom. Now, by the end of 2019, the newcomers had already experienced a variety of persecution experiences like incarceration, prison sentences, lengthy escapes. Some had to pass through tormenting experiences of fleeing through, say, Greece, some even from Iraq, Georgia, and so on. It took several years to reach to their final destination. Occasionally, the families were dispersed all around the world. So when the pandemic started, the Hizmet community was already hit by another pandemic of persecution. We had families that had, been destroyed because of those issues. Estates of businessmen were frozen back in Turkey. People were having all kinds of problems by means of finding travel documents and so on, because the Turkish government was not renewing their travel documents. So the Hizmet community was already trying hard to cope with the problems, not only mental problems, but certainly the mental problems that emanated from these realities. At the earliest days of the pandemic, formerly as a journalist myself and active in human rights advocacy here in London, I came up with the idea of establishing a kind of communication mechanism that will communicate the news to particularly to the newcomers. We realized that our community, largely based in North London, was not able to communicate their policies, services, support mechanisms to the rest of the United Kingdom, because we were not well connected with those small islands of new communities popping up here and there. So we decided to establish a small website where we would actually translate some of the content of government guidelines, mainly on COVID-19, to help people to cope with their own problems on their own. This was also accompanied by Sunday morning Zoom-based broadcast. We didn't move it to YouTube, which would probably reach to more people than it did, but because of the persecution of families, the Hizmet community had its own fears of being, subject to surveillance by Turkish authorities. So we kept it a kind of in-house broadcast. At the height of our broadcast, which still continues on, we served some 500 families from all around United Kingdom. I can assume half of these were stationed in North London. Now let me move to what kind of issues our community had, which had implications for the mental health of the people. First of all, language barriers was a real issue. The government was declaring their guidelines and so on. NHS was actually translating some of the material in several other major minority languages in the country, but Turkish was not one among them. Despite the fact that the Hizmet community is a highly educated community, the newcomers from Turkey had never had any intention to move out of Turkey and didn't need to know foreign languages, particularly elderly people who happened to, flee the country in the last few years were not prepared at all by means of language skills. And this was cutting them off from the general society. This also underlines a general problem, a cultural isolation problem. During the COVID pandemic, we have heard all kinds of issues relating to isolation when you are COVID positive, but the overall immigration communities has been experiencing these isolations. So it was a double isolation issue for the Muslim minority particularly immigrant populations. Think of it, you are cut off from the Turkish-speaking society because of the persecution that's continuing on in Turkey. You cannot travel back to Turkey. A smear campaign is continuing on online and so on. You cannot read Turkish newspapers online because you are not happy with the kind of representation of your movement in government-controlled media back in Turkey, and you are not able to reach to the host society here in the United Kingdom. You don't know the matters of the host society. You don't know what people are dealing with, and so on. So in this Hizmet online broadcast, we try to create channels to the general society. So, for example, as a former journalist, I was briefing the week's news to the Turkish-speaking community. What's happening in politics? What's happening in, of course, Brexit was still an ongoing reality at that stage, and some business people wanted to know what will happen after Brexit is completed, because the Ankara agreement that provided a visa to many Turkish businessmen was actually within the European Union framework. So when United Kingdom got out of the European Union, and it did actually in the end, the visa regime was frozen. It's no longer a valid visa regime. So of course, this created all kinds of uncertainties for the people also. You may know all that Turkish people are good in cuisine. A lot of Turkish businessmen in North London are actually in hospitality industry, mainly in restaurants. But COVID hit those restaurants badly. So that uncertainty, inability to, continue with their businesses and so on, created all kinds of problems. When the government declared its financial support program, we actually had to translate the whole package into Turkish, and also invite accountants, consultants, financial consultants to our program, Q&A sessions with Turkish businessmen and so on, in order to help them. Hizmet movement and Hizmet community is particularly an education movement. It is a faith-inspired, faith-based movement. It's a religiously sensitive Muslim community, but their priority in this world is twofold. They do want to contribute to the general society, and they believe that by way of contributing to the general society, you heal your own problems on spiritual problems, and also educational activism. And suddenly, many families were stuck in a position that their children were not able to go to school. They were missing valuable time by means of education. Many newcomers, asylum-seeking families were stuck in hospices, which usually used to take only 1 month before they were resettled to a temporary house, but still a house. But under COVID pandemic, we have families who have been living in one single hospice room, 5 people, 3 children, and the parents for 17 months now. And of course, this creates all kinds of mental issues for the mother, the father, and the children. And the link between, the respect, which is very important in Turkish family culture, the respect between children and the father and mother is actually destroyed, because the children see helpless parents in front of them who do not speak any language, who cannot go out and work because they don't have work permit and so on. So we needed to deal with all kinds of those issues. What did we do? We invited doctors when necessary. Particularly the Turkish community was bombarded by Turkish social media accounts, which were skeptical about vaccine, particularly, and the whole COVID pandemic, actually. So we invited doctors to overcome those issues. I particularly made a mistake. I invited the very first positive COVID-19 positive case to my broadcast, and it was an awful case. and it caused a lot of anxiety among the people. People didn't realize how awful those days were. Well, this was not an Omicron case, of course. This was the worst case at the initial days of the pandemic, but also it opened eyes to people that they realized that the challenge was real. Many people were, questioning whether this is flu or anything else. We invited psychiatrists, family support people like consultants and so on. Children, for the children, we provided help. The OnlineHizmet Online was itself not providing any one of these services. We actually was the venue, the channel of communication. We invited Time to Help, a humanitarian aid organization, which was actually distributing food for families, which still continues on supporting asylum-seeking families in the hospices. We invited 1111 Academy, which was and still is providing career change advice and online lectures, online English language courses, online integration advice to people. So we managed to convince the people that, okay, this pandemic is we are stuck in house, but we have to turn this into something productive. So if we are going to change our career, that is the best time to take some lectures, courses, and so on. You will remember that many Western universities opened their online courses to free use for people, and we, made a selective list of those courses, invited people to join those courses. We also invited people with positive experiences, Turkish refugees who have done something successful, and sometimes who actually provided advice to others. So these projects help many people to see their future and look at the future with a hope. I personally am also a law student and am helping people with their asylum claims and so on. But of course, the Home Office almost froze all review processes. Family reunions were frozen, and this put a lot of stress on many people. Think of it, your wife and children were in Greece, and the British Home Office is not taking any application, despite the fact that you have been granted a refugee status. In normal times, it will take only 1 to 2 months to have your family reunited. It took years to solve the problem. Even in cases where Home Office had actually granted visa to the rest of the family, travel restrictions prevented people from coming to United Kingdom. So we had to cope with those problems also. Turkish-speaking community is a conservative community which has its own values, like marriage ceremonies are very important, landline events in a history of people. Many marriage ceremonies had to be cancelled or had to be turned into, 5-person marriage ceremonies. I'm sure this had created all kinds of mental pressure, anxiety among the young people also. Funerals are very important. When we had our first case of death in the Hizmet community, an important businessman who was loved by our support base, nobody except for 3 people from the family was led to the graveyard for the funeral. And you have to understand, among the Muslim population, it is a huge issue to be ready and participating to a funeral of a loved one, to give support to the members of the close family and so on. We couldn't do that. What we did, we managed to live broadcast the whole funeral so that people, had some feeling of being ready and participating and praying for the, spiritual well-being of the deceased and so on. A lot of other programs have come to our programs which didn't have any particular relation to mental health. For example, young children at the 5th or 6th grades are getting prepared for grammar school or independent school exams, and people needed advice. Our population is a young population, so many of our families do have young children at early ages of their education years. They needed advice on how to get prepared for those exams and how to overcome the issue of lack of missed education days. When the children moved from face-to-face education to online education, we were there to help. When the children started to turn back to classes, there was another anxiety issue. We were there to help. Here I'm going to stop and look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that very, very insightful account, a very passionate and detailed account of the experience of the Hizmet community. And first, I'd like to begin by extending solidarity to the persecuted Hizmet community who have been hit in many ways, politically, religiously, educationally, socially, and economically during the pandemic, and how this has, of course, impacted their mental health. Hizmet Online is a very, very useful initiative which many families in the UK have, I'm sure, benefited from. So I'd like to thank you for starting up that initiative and coming on here to share that with us, and all the very, very many ways that it has helped the community during the pandemic. And so now we'll be moving on to the Q&A session. So I'd like to just remind the viewers on YouTube, please feel free to put down your comments and your questions for our speakers, and we will hear from them. I'd like to start with the first question, which is to Kerim. In your perspective, during the pandemic, has Islam played more of a role in encouraging people to take better care of their mental health and breaking any stigmas attached to speaking about mental health care in the community?
It's a beautiful issue. I can say at the initial days, because hand washing and related cleanliness issues was at the top of government recommendations, Muslims felt quite proud because our religion advises at least 5 times hand wash a day because of our ablution and so on. That actually gave quite a bit of courage and self-respect at that stage. But then the Muslim community is also, they love hugging and handshaking and so on. Martine had the Moroccan experience. I'm sure she had also observed that, and it became a huge issue. This is not Islamic, this is a cultural issue, but in the East we love hugging. The Welsh people also love hugging. But it took some time to realize that the new normality is a different normality. We will never turn back to the old normality. But on the other hand, Islam also puts a religious duty to care about the health and well-being of the others in the society, whoever the others are. Particularly the Hizmet community is quite sensitive on those issues. So for example, when it came to the issue of vaccine or taking good care of social distancing and so on, we didn't need to convince our community that they need to do this, not because of their own health, but because of the others. Because it was already ingrained in the religious thought of the people.
Thank you so much for your response. And Celestin, this is a question for you. What are some ways mental health research could be decolonized institutionally?
Oh, that's like a whole PhD question.
An entire panel in itself.
Yeah. Look, it's quite in the short time that we have, it's quite difficult to get into a discussion about this because the topics are quite complicated. But the first thing I would say is the first place to start is to question what is the purpose of psychiatry. Okay, what's its purpose? And some people would argue that the purpose of psychiatry is to police the boundaries of normality. Okay, so when you start to police the boundaries of normality, there's all of these people that you define outside of normality, right? So like, you know, there's a reason why it's a lot of Black men on these secure wards being basically arrested into the psychiatric hospitals. Okay, there's a reason for that, and that is the start of a process of like decolonization, right? We need to call into question what we take for granted, what is normally the case. That's what we need to call into question. This doesn't mean that like people shouldn't seek mental health support or anything like this. Okay, you know, you should, if you need some mental health support, you should absolutely go for it. But in terms of researching and trying to think about what could be a more equitable, more, I don't know, loving environment to deal with these kind of problems, I think we need to start from the basics. Like, what is a mental health problem? Who is defined as having a mental health problem? Who is not seen as normal? These are the kind of questions that we need to ask, in my view.
Thank you very much. That was a huge question, and I think you did a fantastic job in whittling it down to a very, very simple beginning to address the issue, a huge issue, very nested issue. And for Martine, what are the different ways local charities like Mind are including different cultures in their ways of addressing and providing mental health care and services, and adapting and tailoring sort of culturally sensitive ways of talking about mental health?
I'm not sure if everybody realises that there is a National Mind charity, and then my charity is called a Local Mind Association. So if you think about National Mind, which is doing campaigns to raise awareness about mental health issues and the need for more funding and that kind of thing, I think that they do try to represent different sections of society. For example, I've just received an email today asking for us to publicise the fact that they want to have a focus group of unrepresented groups so that they can fashion their next campaign and make it more relevant to diverse communities. As a local mind association, we don't usually have the opportunity to do big publicity campaigns. So in the services that we provide, we try to make sure that we employ staff across different cultural groups, and from time to time we get funding for particular areas of work. So for example, we had in the past a programme of counselling for Turkish-speaking community. That led to us having a whole bank of Turkish-speaking counsellors who are still with the service, and that was very relevant to us being in North East London. So we sometimes get the opportunity to focus on specific things. We are just about to start a programme with other local organisations focusing on the AME needs. We're part of partnerships where inequalities and different cultural group needs are a focal point. So we don't always manage to cover all the needs, but both ourselves with National Mind and local partners, we do try to address where we can.
Thank you. Kerim, I think you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I have a question, actually. You know, I have been observing, maybe this is actually an inner observation, maybe I am observing what I am thinking. By the idea of cancelling all kinds of measures against COVID-19, the government has been giving a message, maybe not received well, of being left on our own. And I can observe that among some members of our community, including myself, we do feel that the government no longer cares about, as long as the daily death numbers is less than 300, COVID-19 daily death numbers of 300 is normalized and became acceptable. And that also has left people a kind of anxiety that the government no longer cares. That in the long run might actually become a huge issue for the immigrant communities particularly, but I think for the whole society, if, and hopefully we won't need it anymore, if in the future we will need stricter measures, then the communities will not be willing to listen. So I wondered if the other participants are also observing in their respective communities anxiety about how this whole process is being run and now cancelled.
I can say from the point of view of Martine, Enfield and Barnet, we have had to be at pains to follow government guidance. And as individual members of staff, we may have a particular view, but we have had to, in the main, focus on supporting our clients in the best way possible, whilst being aware that clients clearly have got questions and issues to do with what they see going on around them. And we're generally not able to unpack that in the sort of wellbeing services, but I'm sure it comes up in client support through things like counselling and advocacy and access to services and quality of services and that kind of thing. So I think it's kind of early days, and it's something that I personally have a lot of difficulty with. I am personally very uneasy about the way that the pandemic has rolled out, and I have my own particular response to it, but I have to have an organisational response, and I have to respect that and support as best I can.
Thank you.
Celestin, do you have a response to the question?
No, I think people covered it. I'm not working directly with communities in the same way as other panelists are. And to some extent, I might jump out to the broader sort of macro situation. Is Boris Johnson about to get beheaded in terms of his premiership? Is this why there's no more restrictions and so on? But I do agree with the general sentiment that it's kind of like, if there are vulnerable people, vulnerable communities, the end of the rope has come, and the government no longer is interested in what's happening for particular, potentially more vulnerable or marginalized groups. So, yeah.
And that's the perfect way to round up the session. Thank you so much to our panelists, Martine Drake, Dr. Celestin Okoroji and Kerim Balci, who have all spoken very, very informatively about the different and multidimensional issues when it comes to mental health in various communities within North London. I'd like to thank the YouTube viewers for watching and live streaming and for submitting your questions. And I hope you are there for the next panel session that we will be holding. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye now.